So Matt, this has been your baby. Let's start with you. How has the meeting shaped your thinking around where we need to go next?
I think it's given some clarification, distillation. We've all read reports with 20 recommendations and 7 sub-recommendations, and they're all great. The main reason for this meeting was to put people in the same room, and I think everyone here, by attending, all of you have done spectacularly well there, because we are more focused now on solutions and next steps. The thing that really struck me was just how precious everybody is here. And many people have reinforced that. I kind of knew it, and you think, oh, well, farmers getting out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the knowledge, the collective wisdom, the lack of the failures. So the human capital element here is the thing that's really struck me. So if we look at timing in a crisis, what do we need to do as soon as, what's the priority for me? I would say it is retention of that knowledge and talent as quickly as possible, and in parallel, bringing people in, whether it be small biotechs or academic groups or whatever that is. So I think that the element of crisis, the need for timely action, has really been about people. And so I'm most grateful to everyone here for coming to this meeting, so we can help retain and share that knowledge and reverse this really distressing exit from this space as soon as we can.
I'm not going to go sequentially down the table, but I'm going to go to you next, Dame Sally. You're on the UN coordinating panel to fight AMR and the WHO's executive board. How are you defining the priorities, and what do you want to see at the top of the agenda?
Well, clearly we do need new drugs, but we also need to make sure people are getting the right drugs, getting the right drugs. And I think we should never forget infection prevention control, which includes vaccinations. But what do I think? I think that we shouldn't lose the opportunity of a good crisis. We have to turn this round and use it as a rallying call. There's a need for novel technologies, not just for new drugs and diagnostics, but actually are the cheaper, easier ways of cleaning, preserving, sterilizing. Are there good ways of educating everyone? And by that I mean the public, as well as the practitioners. We need to bring more people in, I would absolutely agree, and all of this will take money. And we're going to need research, not just in the lab, and with patients on new drugs. We actually need research, and that was where I was yesterday, another AMR meeting, on stewardship models. What are the right ways to do stewardship? And there are some that we can link into economic models, but there are others that will be cultural specific. And so before I finish, let me just say that a priority for me is trying to find the right economic model or models that will allow us to develop new drugs, market them appropriately with stewardship. And I think that, and Jennifer was talking about that this morning, as well as yesterday, is going to be really difficult. So I'll put economic models and stewardship at the top.
Ramanan, at the end of the table, you straddle 2 countries, the US and India, the developed world and the developing world. How do you see the priorities? Do you see a difference in across those 2?
I can barely see where you are.
That's not a bad thing.
Like these are roses between the 5 thorns, I guess. So we're at the other end. I would echo. Well, that's what I meant. So I think what Sally said is spot on, which is although all the stuff we've discussed for the last 3 days is fantastic, this is where the future will be in 15 or 20 years from now. The immediate challenge is that millions of people will die without access and also without conservation of effectiveness. I think we need a global conservation fund that the UN interagency panel will have to somehow bring to life. We need to deploy that to promote appropriate stewardship across a range of developing countries that have not realized what antibiotic resistance is really going to do to them. It's going to roll back a lot of the gains that have been made on, particularly on under 5 mortality, particularly neonatal mortality reductions. I think we have an agenda ahead in terms of educating policymakers about this. They've signed on to something in New York, but I don't think they quite recognize the implications for what they're doing. And I think there's a broader education exercise that needs to happen. 20 years ago, I'm sure people would have been smoking in this room quite freely without anyone saying anything about it. But things have changed, and that's now socially unacceptable to smoke inside, or indeed to smoke anywhere these days. Now, why is it that demanding an antibiotic is socially acceptable? Why is it that buying an antibiotic freely over the counter is socially acceptable? It may be the need, but may not necessarily be what we wanted to what we want to inculcate. So until every 5-year-old knows that antibiotics are precious drugs that need to be preserved, we haven't quite finished the job.
Jennifer, you work for Big Pharma. What's it going to take for pharmaceutical companies to stay interested, to want to bring out the next novel therapy?
So a couple of things. One is for sure a commercial model. There's a lot of competing interests, and it gets harder and harder when you start getting more and more complex molecules that require, really intensive manufacturing as well, right? So when you start departing from a lot of the knowns, you start getting into more and more complicated chemistry, more dedicated manufacturing, things that add costs that when you're starting out in discovery, you're not really thinking about that as a big part of what the cost of your development is going to be. And it can turn out to be, somewhere between 10 and 25% of your total development costs can be material. So in the end, you've got to be able to manufacture that and sustain that manufacturing and supply chain. And as API providers start to dwindle and your choices get smaller and smaller, it just makes that case harder. And so if you're not going to be working in a volume environment, which is what we're hopefully getting away from, then there's this big disconnect between how you're going to commercialize and be able to sustain a supply for your material. So that's one challenge. What will keep big pharma interested, I believe, is if we can find ways to connect the need to other areas that are high priority. And so that's the case that I've been making for 15 years now is, look, we want to do regenerative medicine. We want to be able to, work in a lot of oncology, in transplant, places where you have very high infection rates. And so I kind of think of it as like, let this be your loss leader, right? This is the milk, and then you go charge a lot for the icing on the cake. And so if somehow we can connect it and make a bigger impression on how the ability to develop and use your, more fancy, big dollar drugs are going to be compromised by your patients having life-threatening infections that you can't treat, it's going to make your other drug look pretty bad. So I just keep looking at it like this is connected to everything else that you do as a big pharma. So how do we get that to somehow connect to the business model when the sales forces are very distinct? The oncology sales force doesn't sell antibiotics.
Yeah.
Maybe they should. Maybe there should be some kind of merger. It's not the same skill set necessarily and training, but if there's some way to connect those, it may make it more palatable.
John Rex, you've worked in Big Pharma, and how would you respond to that from your perspective on funding models and some of the solutions around that?
So, those of you who don't know my story, I was the head of anti-infectives at AstraZeneca until recently, and we actually sold our pipeline to another company. And it was an interesting choice for AZ, and I don't actually, for the standpoint of AZ as a company, I think it was, had to sell off several pieces of themselves because of the need to raise money to be focused on another area. And the essence of strategy is about making choices. And so the good news is that pipeline is going to go on to be well cared for at another company. The difficulty is that the knowledge about the team, a lot of the knowledge resides in the team that develops the skills. And again, the group I was working with is now dispersed, and some of them are consultants with other companies, so I actually think the knowledge is kind of going to filter back out there. I think that's a good thing. But to keep the companies in this area, for me, it's about, we really do have to change the business model. We have to think about buying antibiotics, the way that we do, fire extinguishers and fire stations. And, there are only three things that I'm really doing right now. One is I'm trying to develop drugs in other settings. I work in the small companies as well. I'm trying to make it possible to develop new drugs. I work on regulatory pathways. And then the third thing is this helping to inform and support the conversation that leads to a change in the business models. And that's going to take quite a bit of effort. But, I am there to bring into that sort of the sense of what it really feels like to create a drug.
Dr. Xu, NIH, what role can your organization play in shaping that?
Okay, I want to talk about the policy, economy, and market-driven, and also those and skills. But from an NIH view, I think science is still the key to driven. For science, look at first we talk about pharmacophore. For new drugs, we need novel pharmacophore. Now, if we're based on a pharmacophore we have now, I think scientists already from academia for industry work very hard, exhausted, but didn't get something new. So for us, I think we need to funding and also to recruit scientists to work on how to find a novel pharmacophore. For example, uncountable cells, bacteria, probably the one of the solution for that, try to do that. But we don't know how to culture uncountable cells. The second, I think we need to do deep science, deep biology. For example, for antibacterial, for gram-negatives, the major issue for gram-negatives, that is permeability and efflux pump. Do we understand that? Probably not. So that's why we want to fund research to understand permeability and understand efflux pump. And from other way, for vaccine, we do have very successful vaccine for human use. But recent years, we try to Staph aureus and others, Pseudomonas. All these trials fail by phase 2 or phase 3. Why?
You mentioned drugs, you mentioned vaccines. Liz, what else can we be doing and doing much sort of faster and even doing now?
So I think all of these are great points, and I notice that social science is often not included in this issue and the community. So I really think one of the top things is education and engagement. There's not that many people in the room relative to the people that antibiotic resistance affects. And so the anti-smoking campaign, I used that in the media interview once just to say, we can turn this around and let people know that this is a big problem. I still don't think that people realise how big a problem it is. And I think this is so important because most of the things that get changed in this world are community-driven. Shareholders are community. And I think it's really important that people understand there's an excess issue and an access issue. And those two things need to be explained really well. And I know Dame Sally has got an advertising campaign going. I think that's essential. And then by using that diversity of people, of the community and different stakeholders, including politicians and industry as well, then we'll really have an idea of what the solutions should be and what solutions are actually going to work. Because at the end of the day, people have to take the medicines. And I think the patients need to be driving that. a lot.
Matt, how do we need to be changing our messaging and communications around this?
Yeah, so Liz has mentioned that, and we'll get dancing molecules. So I mean, there are two ways forward. The fear cell is a very strong cell, but not sustainable. And I think the Wellcome Trust commissioned an analysis of this, and people get crisis fatigue. It's, what is the zeitgeist here? And I guess I've heard a few interesting things about the microbiome. And the public, everybody loves the microbiome. Whether it's meaningful, causal, or associative, who cares? That's a scientific question. But if you take an antibiotic, you'll get an upset stomach. Maybe we could write a bit of that in terms of holistic medicine and use that as messaging. But that's it's an interesting question. How can we change human practice? Because once we do get a new drug, we've got to make damn sure we take care of it. And we look back to Australia. We're one of the highest per capita prescribers. How do we start that going the other way?
I know I'm the moderator. I'm not meant to be sharing my views, but I'm going to share mine. As a journalist, and working on writing about health, my eyes would glaze when I heard about superbugs. I figured we've been hearing about this for a very long time. Antibiotics still work, at least where I live. They work on me. What is the problem? And it wasn't until I heard the story about the prostate biopsies when I actually understood that it was actually changing clinical practice, and that men who were otherwise healthy were dying as a complication of their prostate biopsy. That kind of hit home. And then the other thing that really hit home for me that I also think needs to be explained by scientists to the community is the biology of bacteria. How they stack up mechanisms for resistance, and not just drug resistance, but mechanisms for resisting silver. And silver nanoparticles are in your refrigerator, in your socks, and everywhere. So how we're constantly in our environment selecting for superbugs. I just don't think that is something that the general that there is in the general awareness. And I think once you understand how these bacteria stack up these mechanisms, like you stack up carriages on a train, and how selecting for one carriage selects for the entire train. So I'm done now.
We had this hormone-free beef campaign from a supermarket here, and people flocked to it. Why can't we have antibiotic-free beef? So once we get someone like a big chain to then do the marketing for us, we know we've won.
Well, of course, that is happening in the States. The classic, the one that started it was called Shake Shack. And actually, it's quite nice,
They're
fast
good,
food.
yeah.
The beef tattoos?
But McDonald's have followed with the chickens. So various people are doing that consumer pull in the States. How deep it goes at the moment, I don't know. But there are investors now beginning to say, we will not invest in food companies that use antibiotics for growth promotion. So I think it's back to Liz's point about the importance of the community and their awareness and their involvement in this. They need to pull this and say, we are worried about overuse. We are worried that new ones are not coming. We know we will have to pay. So we have these debates about who's going to pay for the new antibiotics. Well, let me be quite clear. Every one of us is going to pay. We might pay as out-of-pocket expenses because the companies have to charge us. We might pay through our taxes, but we will end up paying. It's only a question of which model we use to pay, not will we, because companies have to be funded to do this. And people don't understand that. They think, oh, someone should be paying and not us.
Ramanan?
So I have to say, for the folks in this audience, you all have a very bright future ahead because, without a doubt, I don't think money for new antibiotics is going to go away anytime soon, and probably will go up significantly over time. So to some extent, we've sort of reached that bottom of where we didn't have too many people working on new drug discovery, and it's good to see that coming back. Now, when Sweden took out antibiotics from meat, for instance, so just switching about 30 years ago, it was not because of antibiotic resistance. It was because some journalist wrote an article about antibiotics in meat, and the Swedes said, oh my God, I didn't know there were antibiotics in my meat. I mean, it had nothing to do with drug resistance. They just didn't want antibiotics in their meat. This is also true in the States. It is not drug resistance that's really driving it. It's just that when you have an option of antibiotic-free, you can go to any federal cafeteria and you have an antibiotic-free option. One of the things that President Obama did, which about 3 years ago, which very few people even in the States know about, is there was a White House executive order which changed the purchasing stance of the US government, the entire US government, to a pro-antibiotic effectiveness stance. What that meant was that all else being equal, if there were two identical products, the one that had been raised without antibiotics would be the one that got the preference, which meant that across the military, across all of the federally funded cafeterias, this was what changed. And this is really what moved quite a bit. It wasn't just necessarily consumers, but when that happened, consumers had the option, and then when they saw the option, it wasn't, again, drug-resistant pathogens. They're not seeing this. What they're seeing is, do I want antibiotics in my food or do I not want antibiotics in my food? And their natural instinct is, I don't want antibiotics in my food. And I think that's a very powerful story that will work around the world. It certainly would resonate, I think, in much of Europe, and I would hope in Australia as well, because I think we've said many times, this is the only sort of developed country where use of antibiotics is rising, where it's falling in all other developed countries.
Yes, but rising with it too are things like childhood asthma. And we know that there is a link with the microbiome and inflammatory diseases like asthma. I think that there is a lot more work that scientists can do in communicating some of those fairly well accepted links, Matt.
I think, it's like everything. There's a cost and a benefit. And as a consumer, if you take an antibiotic unnecessarily, there is a cost. So that message is a pretty simple one. And we could do a lot more there, I think. So I think that's the zeitgeist. You try, when you do with advertising, you try 5 things and one works. Or if you've got such and such, but maybe that's something to do.
Dame Sally, I lived in Singapore for a while, and that's where the prescriber, like in many parts of Asia and around the world, is also the dispenser. So she or he gets a cut of whatever is dispensed. That sounds like a great platform, not a great platform for stewardship. Are the medical and veterinary fraternity ready to give up their vested interests for the sake of preserving antimicrobials? And how can government address these conflicts of interest?
I think that's a very good point. We do no longer have dispensing doctors. We still have dispensing vets, and their argument is that in rural areas, the poor farmer couldn't then go into town, if it's going to take them an hour or two, and get the antibiotics and go back out. So what we have to do is reduce it to the minimum and make sure that the vets that are dispensing behave with probity and responsibly. And I think many do. I'm much more concerned about many poor countries where there are no prescriptions because there aren't enough clinicians, and the majority of antibiotics are bought from kiosks or market stalls. Because then, did they need them? If they're buying them, do they buy a full course? Probably not. And a significant number will be counterfeit and have inadequate doses. So they may get better anyway because they didn't need them. But that just seems to me to be taking money out of the pockets of poor people and not giving them a good service. But we've got to help those countries develop a workforce.
We also need good diagnostics to identify whether something warrants an antibiotic or not. We haven't discussed diagnostics yet. Anyone want to comment on that? Also, please, there are microphones in the audience. We want to keep this as interactive as possible, so please come forward with your questions as well and comments, but keep them short. Are very welcome.
Diagnostics actually face a problem that's almost harder than antibiotics. And it's helpful to sort of rearrange a little bit how you approach them. I think the most interesting class of diagnostic is a set of tools that allow you to not start an antibiotic. And that actually isn't necessarily the case that it is a physical diagnostic that is the most important element of that. So a lot of it begins with educating the physician or the healthcare provider and the patient about the fact that many upper respiratory illnesses don't require an antibiotic. And it just becomes difficult when you've gone to all the trouble to bring your 3-year-old to the clinic and you're looking for some relief and you're thinking, come on, can't you do anything? And this notion of being taught, as Ramanan said, from early age, that it's acceptable not to treat. Because there is also, the reason antibiotics get used is that, in fact, when they are effective, they are dramatically effective and they are life-saving. And so it can be difficult to talk yourself out of that in a borderline case. And so the idea of social tools that allow you to say, it's okay not to treat, and everybody is kind of trained in the art of that. And then it could be that a diagnostic at the end of the day is a helpful thing, particularly if it's got a lot of flashing lights and is very impressive, and it might encourage you to believe that you don't actually need a therapy. But I don't know that it's so much the test as it is the overall strategy in which the test is used.
Well, I was going to tie that question to something that I think is attached to the question of diagnostics, and that is, as we get into more and more niche products, then you want to be able to know whether something is an appropriate therapy, because there is a safety concern, right? Aside from not treating the disease, you're also exposing somebody to an unnecessary, millimolar concentration of something. So the safety concern, the bar is pretty high, and so the diagnostic is helping you avoid putting something into a person that is frankly toxic at some level. So I think that the diagnostic has to help us define who the appropriate patient is, both from the efficacy and also from the safety perspective. So it is necessary to have them.
So I see this coming from left field, from Google or someone like that. So if you look at diabetes in the 1980s, if you're diabetic, the diabetic machine was this big and it was bedside in the hospital. And so you had a pretty tough time as a diabetic. Now you manage your insulin with a self-closing loop through Bluetooth. If you were pregnant in the 18th, 19th century, it was an empirical malaise, and now you can take a pill, but you can also get you pee on a stick, and if you're not sure about that, you do it again, and you're pregnant at home. So these tools can really empower consumers and change human health. In the 19th century, if you want to know if you had a bacterial versus a viral infection, you go, and the doctor would go, and now in the 21st century, where we are, you go, So that simple question, bacterial versus viral, is incredibly hard to answer. But I don't think it's coming from the diagnostic companies. I think it will come from technology, and it will be left field. But that one thing really is a game changer for this bit. You don't have to worry so much about what the bug is, but do you take amoxicillin or not? It would change everything.
Or do you take a teaspoon of Manuka honey, Liz?
Actually, I was speaking to someone the other day from the Woolcock Institute. She's a paediatrician, works in respiratory infections, and for kids younger than 5, for throat infections, the first thing she says is suck some honey, because it actually does give them some relief. I really like your idea, John, about the confidence issue. I give a tutorial to various students at UTS about, how do we solve the antibiotic resistance problem, and they're different stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders, patient, doctor, health organisation, pharma, etc. And then we always end up with a comment of, well, if I've gone to the doctor and I don't come away with a pill or a drug, then what am I paying for? And then there's a pregnant pause, and then everyone starts to laugh because we start criticising people for doing that, and then we realise that we do it ourselves. So it's a real issue about, is it bad to say you don't need an antibiotic? But diagnostics are less common than new drugs, yeah?
And they hit this reimbursement problem. It's really even more difficult than with the antibiotics, I think. And particularly if you're having to having to say to your employer, I have to take the afternoon off to take my kid, and he was so sick that he needed an antibiotic. Now it's okay. Now it's okay. Okay? But if he wasn't sick enough to need an antibiotic, then maybe you really shouldn't have taken the afternoon off. And, you know, that's an unfortunate way that we work into this. And there is a, I don't know, it's going to take what Ramanan said. You know, we got to start with the 5-year-olds, and by the time they're the moms and dads, they'll know that they'll have that sort of burned into them that there's a different strategy that has to be pursued. And the answer, in fact, antibiotics can hurt you, and the most likely outcome, actually, if you're treating an upper respiratory illness, is that you'll be injured by the antibiotic rather than benefit from it.
I just, having come recently from India, and where the driver who dropped me off at the airport, I was having a discussion with him about my talk, and it was all new to him. He was like, really? But we take antibiotics like we take tea. And this is a country, of course, where there are thousands of people dying from preventable diseases, and access is a huge issue. And so just trying to reconcile those two needs is very difficult. Ramanan, do you have, I know that we've already touched on this, but what is the solution for that? Is it education ultimately?
Well, first of all, you know, the problem of the excess and the access is not in the same place. The urban areas have a huge amount of the excess. The rural areas have a lot of the access issues. So it's actually geographically separated quite a bit. It's converging now, but it's still quite different between those two areas. So if we were to restrict access in the cities to, you know, the newer generation cephalosporins, to the penims, it is entirely doable. In fact, I was talking to someone over the break, and in fact, you know, they were asking, well, you know, India has been regulating opioids. You can't actually get an opioid over the counter in India. You can't get...
you can get Xanax.
What's that?
You can get Xanax.
Yeah, you can get marijuana as well, but that's cultural. But you know, the laws can be enforced when they have to be enforced, and that is true across most of the world. So, in fact, India had put in this class of Schedule H1 drugs, which were meant to be these specific antibiotics that could not be given except without a prescription. Unfortunately, the political class has still not come to grips with how important this problem really is and how it's going to come back to bite them. But I think, you know, in response to your question, first, I think nobody needs access to carbapenems in a retail pharmacy. It's just not necessary. So things like that could be enforced. The second is vaccination. India is about to introduce the pneumococcal vaccine. The rotavirus vaccine is already underway. And that will make a big difference, at least, you know, for some set of, at least for the kids who would otherwise be receiving the antibiotics. A third thing is on water and sanitation. Now, this is obviously the toughest of challenges. And you know, I don't want to get too graphic just to provide the artist, you know, material for what she has to draw. But you know, clearly the sheer volume of you know, open defecation and the lack of sanitation is really a challenge. And unless we solve these big issues, there are no shortcuts to solving the problem with antibiotics. I mean, we have some quick fixes, but the bigger ones, like educating 5-year-olds, these are long-term strategies. But then we can make a choice. We can say, well, that's just too difficult, just like we're saying, you know, climate is too difficult, and then, you know, we bear the consequences. So that's a challenge that lies ahead of us. And you know, I think, you know, for instance, you know, Sally's leadership on this to raise this to that level, that the people who can solve the problem are not typically within countries. They are at the UN level. They're at the global leadership level. We need the UN Secretary General to be paying attention to this. It can only be solved in that way. This is not a medical problem. It's truly a global environmental problem.
Yeah, thanks. We have several questions. On my left, go ahead, sir.
On the issue of sustainable funding for antimicrobial R&D, I still think that the expertise is in the pharma companies. Could this R&D and that for neglected diseases be made part of the license to operate for pharmaceutical companies? If you want to enter a business that generates double-digit returns for shareholders, could R&D into this type of problem be part of the license to operate?
So interestingly, the independent review by Jim O'Neill came out with a delinked model which was nicknamed Play or Pay. And the idea he had, that was supported by a number of people, was either the companies needed to fund research into antimicrobial resistance, or they had to pay, we wouldn't call it a tax, so it was called a levy. And that is exactly what you're saying. Of course, immediately my friends from pharma rang me up and said, bring it on, we know how to game that one so we don't have to pay. But, you know, there are models like that people are talking about.
A recurring theme seems to be education of the general public, and Ramanan was just sort of mentioning getting not so much global leaders, but leaders in places like the UN, and a few ties have also been made to climate change. And when I think before I got into science, I'd never heard of climate change, and then I saw an inconvenient truth. And I think for a lot of people in the public, that was kind of the you know, you sort of see a celebrity or somebody like that getting involved in an issue like this. I mean, I guess this is kind of more a comment, but feel free to elaborate. Has anyone contacted Al?
He is aware.
We don't need Al, we have Dame Sally. Was there another question on my left?
Yeah. I'd just like to mention that in addition to social scientists, it'd probably be useful to have someone representing animal health, maybe a veterinarian on the committee. I'm a veterinarian. I'm a member of the Australian Veterinary Association sort of antimicrobial stewardship group. And the World Veterinary Association also has a stewardship group. You know, there's a lot of good stuff happening, and you mentioned that Australia has one of the highest or growing uses of antibiotics. Not everyone might agree, but the data that's available suggests that Australia is actually one of the lowest users of antimicrobials in animals. I talk to producers quite regularly that raise animals, chickens, with no antibiotics, and have been doing that for years, but nobody knows about it. You know, this is sort of something that they do because it's part of their social conscience, etc. But I'm just thinking in terms of a research agenda. I mean, there are many examples around the world where infection prevention and control is at a very high and sophisticated level in animal production, lots of vaccines used and very little use of antimicrobials. You know, just imagine if you're able to transfer that knowledge and expertise to those parts of the world where maybe veterinarians weren't really sort of highly populated and not influencing what happens, but if you could actually spread that and start to improve, you know, some of the conditions that we're all appalled by in presentations earlier in the week. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'd be very interested in the panel's thoughts in terms of dose optimization of the coalface. You know, we've heard quite a lot about the reasons why new antimicrobials fail and getting the PK/PD wrong, for example. Even if we get the right diagnosis and the right idea about deploying a drug, and we have certain limited amount of information available in the label, at the end of the day we still have a patient of a different shape, a different size, a different demography, and we have a different antibiogram regionally, geographically, which is changing. And at the end of the day we have a clinician sitting there who has to make a decision about getting the dose right. So it doesn't take much for an MIC twofold change or a different kind of pathogen to be present. So I'd be interested. I know there are some efforts underway with PK/PD Compass and others. How do we ensure we get the dose right at the coalface?
I reckon that would be a good question for Dr. Lee, and maybe Dr. Xu, but Dr. Lee from Monash, who was doing a lot of the work on colistin. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Thank you. I think that's a topic I want to raise as well. I think that's probably one of the topics we really missed at this conference. But there's good reason for that, because when Matt and talking about this conference, I think we should definitely focus on the drug discovery point. But I totally agree with Craig. I think that's a very critical issue. No matter how active the drug is, you don't use it properly, you lose it, basically. But I certainly can see some difficulties for antimicrobial pharmacologists to get funding from funding agencies, because some of the science not really like you can get a Nature paper or Science paper. Sounds like very simple, but actually quite difficult to get funding from that. So I think there are lots of hurdles for this aspect as well. Even, for example, for antibiotic combinations, people think very simple, but actually in the clinic, not as simple to do that. And even people don't think that evidence-based practice. So I think there's still lots of education need to be done for that aspect, I guess.
Craig, just to follow up, it's an excellent point, because this is why this area is so difficult. But I've been thinking about this, and what we need to do is invent a watch that can measure the concentration of a drug in the body in real time, non-invasively. And I'm not joking, because we do need to think about disruptive, and that would be used in pharma all over the place. But it's those types of crazy ideas that will make breakthroughs here, not incremental. I mean, we need PKPD, et cetera, but I do think there will be some left field technology coming in, like a watch that measures the drug concentration. That it goes back to insulin and diabetes. I've worked in diagnostics for a long, long time, and Medtronic had this closed loop, and so you measure your insulin and you would then give the glucose. But they refused to allow the closed loop. They had to have someone. And these teenage kids, they cracked it. They reprogrammed the code, and because they couldn't be bothered reading it and everything else. So, technology, I think that's where we need to look to solve some of these really complex questions. We just haven't got the tech at the moment to solve that. So let's invent the tech.
I reckon we will leave it here, but perhaps let the panel have one sort of parting few words. I just think what you said makes me think that we need a lot of younger people getting involved in this. We can't, younger people.
New ideas and ambition, and realizing that you can do the impossible.
Please, let's go down the panel. What are the parting thoughts you're going to leave with the conference, Dame Sally?
Great, there were so many people, but why isn't it full? We need to bring many more young researchers in, and we need to reach out to the public.
Yeah, reaching out to the public is a big thing, of course. I also think that we need to be multidisciplinary. We need to really work across those disciplines, and I still think that scientists need to look at people that do research in other areas, completely different areas, because we need to listen to them.
So my parting words would be that this is, there's a lot of academics in this room, and one of the big challenges is chemical technologies. So one of the biggest challenges in discovering new antibacterials is trying to find ones that have really nice chemical properties so that you can dose them at very high concentrations, you have good solubility, you can deliver them as an IV. But yet when you go to screen molecules in that property space, they're not terribly potent. So you need to have a balance between technologies that allow you to detect and optimize those molecules even when you have very, very weak potency, and then you have to have the ability to continue to do optimization on those compounds when they're in a highly polar space, when they're going to be complex chemistry. So those are also areas that don't tend to get Nature publications, but they're areas that are really important in order to be able to get better and better molecules, not just more potent, but to have the safety, to have the solubility, and then of course the ability to manufacture very complex molecules. So I think chemical technologies is an area that's pretty under-resourced.
Well, by nature, I'm kind of an optimist, and I take a lot of encouragement from the amount of energy that has appeared in this area. All of you are here today, and the number of meetings that are occurring this year is just it's almost like I can't keep up. And that's a wonderful thing to see, the enthusiasm. When CARB-X opened its doors for 4 days for applications last fall, we thought we were going to get about 50 applications. We got 168 in 4 days. It really blew us away, but it was really exciting to see that there were that many people who were willing to engage and work in an area that fundamentally, financially, is kind of, as I said this morning, it's irrational, actually, to go to work on a new antibiotic. And yet we're seeing these ideas, and not everything won't work at CARB-X, but some of it will. And I am delighted by seeing everybody who's made time to be at this event, and the fact that this event occurred at all. I think it's a great thing. And so I'm just pleased that we're talking about stuff that 5 years ago it wasn't on anybody's radar. And that's a big change for me.
Okay, by nature, I think science is still important. When we talk about policy, we talk about economy, about everything. First, you need a good product. How you got it? Like you mentioned this morning, X. We need that kind of X in our table. So that's important. That is, we want to continue funding research. We still need a deep biology. And we want to work on this area. That also we need new, fresh people work on that. From NIH, we have another topic. We try to put industry and academia together. That because people work in industry, they meet some problems. This kind of problems probably not communicated with academia well. So if academia, they have good science, of course, yeah. But now if they know these kind of problems, then we can work together. And as our government agency, whatever funding, we will be very, very happy to fund those kind of area to address real problem.
Well, a couple of things. I think, not to forget people who don't have antibiotics, let's not leave them behind. And the second is, after the UN, some of you are probably wondering, well, what can I do to connect up with this process? We formed a coalition called CARA, the Conscience of Antibiotic Resistance Action. I'm sorry I didn't put up that link yesterday, but if you search for CARA, C-A-R-A, and antibiotics, if you belong to any sort of an organization, professional society, and you're interested in being part of the pressure group that keeps this issue alive and makes sure that Sally and her colleagues are doing their job on the interagency panel, then this is the way to do it. For better or worse, we don't really have, the kind of patient groups that show up in New York or at the United Nations for HIV, for instance. That doesn't exist in this space. So the people who speak for antibiotic resistance are all of you and all of us here. It's not someone on the outside, because even when people die of drug-resistant infections, they don't know they died of a drug-resistant infection. In fact, a very prominent politician in India recently died of a drug-resistant infection, but very, very few people know about it. And of course, Jason, knows this out, being a journalist, he goes to India often, and he found out that this was the case. Now, unless we all push for action, it is not always going to be inevitable that it will get attention. It is not inevitable that Dr. Xu will have money to hand out for research. It is not inevitable that CARB-X will continue to get funded. So I'm optimistic, but let's not forget that we brought this issue to this level, and we have a responsibility to make sure that it delivers and stays there. So just a plea on that front.
Well, we're going to wrap it up. Matt's got some final words.
Final things. So the first thing is we live in a democracy, even in this little place here. So we get to vote, I believe, behind us or somewhere. There it is. There it is. And the winner is novel antimicrobial drug discovery. Fantastic. Let's give it up for novel antimicrobial. Congratulations.
Followed by education.
Followed by education and awareness, and closely followed by new funding models. There you go, gold, silver, and bronze. I just wanted to try and leave you with some imagery, because icons mean a lot to us visual creatures. So Terry the tiger, and we have Jen the gorilla. Don't worry, Jen, you missed the talk, but it makes sense to me. And then I realised we've got Rex the rhino. Okay, so, you know, these people are very special, as are the animals to us. And so we need a selective breeding program, a tropical island, you know, let's bring that on, let's bring it on. I just wanted to finish with a couple of motivational things, and these were really put together on experience, because this is really hard, right? But we can do it. So what is it going to take to fix this? Well, it's going to take motivation, and I guess we are all here because of that. And Lou Holt's, you know, ability, attitude, motivation gets you out of bed in the morning at whatever time. And the one thing I realised is just so important is just keep on going on. And Woodruff T. Wilson was a pretty crap president, but he did get it right. Genius is overrated. Persistence is the key. What does it take? Well, you have to be confident, because again, failure is easy. And if you say no to a project or whatever, you'll always be right. And that happens a lot in pharma and academia and everywhere. There is no try. Mentors, and I think I'm coming back to that. You know, I have been lucky to meet people like John and David Schlaze, the last 3 rhinos, but we do need a lot more of those, and we need to regenerate it. And then the team. You know, as with this conference, it's all about the team. And then just to phone up, hard work. Genius is overrated. And this is my particular favourite. It's not who I am underneath, but it's what I do that defines me. And I thought when I was young, the key to this was ideas. You know, you had to be smart and have ideas. And I realise now, having been in industry, the idea is just the 0.1 of a 0.1%, and everything else comes above. So the reason I'm doing this is I spent 3 years travelling, and Ramanan, thank you for just reminding us that most people don't have access to antibiotics, so that is a key thing. But I guess I saw a lot of people die, and I saw a lot of people that were saved, and I think that's something that we are all in this together, no matter where we live. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Safe travels, and do stay in touch. The main reason for this meeting is to connect people, and I hope that you've made some connections. Work on those, follow up with emails, collaborate. Thank you for coming.